One of the top things that any fractional CFO should be doing for you is giving you some type of future looking deliverable. And we call that forecasting. But there's a difference between cash flow forecast, budgets, and projections. And even though all of it is future looking and all of it relates to what's going on down the line, there's a big difference between what they're telling you. And what I want to do with this episode is outline the core differences between cash flow forecast and budget and projection, but also help you make your forecast a little bit more accurate with some tools that we use as CFOs in order to estimate and then to realistically plot what's going to happen. So there's a couple of things that you want to keep in mind. Number one, cash flow forecast is going to predict for you what your cash balance is out into the future. So you're going to want to have a good grip on all the bank accounts that are in the business, what drives them up or down, and figure out, well, where are we going to be from a cash perspective in 1, 6, 12 months from now, using the different ways cash flows in and out of your business. And that includes the money that you're taking out of it and putting it to your personal. That includes all of the different things like the loans you're paying off and so on. And the cash flow is going to tell you what you're going to have in your bank account in the future. Whereas budgets and projections are going to forecast out the activity, the operations of your business. So maybe you have budgets on certain projects or budgets for certain customers or budgets for certain initiatives in your company. You're going to want to have some type of projection or budget as to what is going to happen to drive those results. We have a ton of projections for our customers. So we have, for example, a projected headcount for one of our customers because they have high turnover. So what we do is we try to figure out, okay, if this many people come in and this many people leave the company, where's that going to leave us in terms of a net headcount in about 6 months? And we want to be growing that headcount over time. And this could happen even if you don't have high turnover. You could be looking at, well, what's our team look like now? And what's the projection of what we're going to have for team expenses into the future based on the fact that we want to grow by 5 people. So the projected headcounts or the projected spend or the projected revenue, those all go into your cash flow forecast, but it's really important to have some type of individual projection to tell you what's going to happen or what you're expecting to have happen related to each of those narrow objectives. So we have budgets for each project for one of my entertainment companies that I manage. And what we do is we look at the different budgets for each production and say, are we going to come in over or under budget? And then if we come in under budget, what are we doing with that cash flow? So there's a whole separate decision happening with cash flow forecasting and with budgets and projections. So they're not one and the same. But when we talk about making a more accurate projection or accurate forecast in your business, what we have to include are a few key concepts. And number one is that directionally correct is better than perfect. And this was a term that Michael King taught me. He was one of my mentors coming in fractional CFO world. Shout out to Mike. He has an amazing program. And what he taught me with forecasting was that a lot of accountants, typically, we want to be perfect. We want to be accurate. We want to be reliable. We are logical human beings. And what he kind of taught was, hey, Shan, hey, team, it's really not about being perfect or about getting it right on the nose. And this isn't a quiz, a test of accuracy. What it should be is pointing in the direction. It's a compass. It's not exactly a plot of coordinates on the map, but it's a compass saying we're heading in this direction. If you make these decisions in your business today, this is where your business is going to go tomorrow. And that is really important for a business owner to see on paper or on a spreadsheet. And that's what I realized was the key deliverable, was directionally correct information, that we're heading in the right direction, or we know what direction we're heading in, and that we're not worried about getting down to the penny, down to the dollars. We're not staying too close to the dollar sign. That's another expression that I learned from working with him was stop staying so close to the damn dollar sign. We have to go away and talk about the thousands of dollars, not the tens of dollars. We don't want to be nitpicking the accuracy. We want to be looking at holistically, what is happening to the business if they hire another person? Holistically, what is happening if they decide to invest in this objective or this event or whatever? What is that going to do? And when we look at forecasting, we have to focus on directionally correct information. So as I put it, put the rocks in the jar first, put the big ticket things, the big things you want to accomplish, the big objectives, the big spend. and then focus on, okay, let's fill in the rest with the granular information and see if it actually moves the needle in the aggregate. Because if it doesn't, then we're fine. We know what direction we're heading in. We have enough to make decisions off of. And that's the key thing, is knowing how much information is sufficient for you to make a decision. Like, do I need to know down to the penny how much I'm spending on office supplies? No, I don't. I don't. I just need to know, like, okay, how much is labor? How much are our product costs? Cool. I can swing this new expense, or I can swing this new recurring item, and that's okay. So whatever it takes to make the decision. The other thing is, always approach a forecast, especially if you're looking at cash flow forecasting or budgeting, approach with conservative revenue, aggressive expenses. Assume there will be overages. Assume there will be a roundup on the expenses, and round down anything that isn't 90% likelihood revenue. And just operate with the assumption. And you may want to have multiple forecasts, by the way. You may want to have multiple versions. One that's like the realistic, the grounding down to earth, like example. And then one that's like the, dream scenario, like one that's like the pie in the sky view. Because what you'll notice is that if you are like, okay, we're happy with the outcome, even if we are at the most conservative revenue level, you're good. Like, you want to be painting the picture of, at the most conservative revenue, are we still positive cash flow? At the most conservative revenue, are we still looking at the numbers, in a positive way? Are we still going to be profitable? Are we still going to be able to accomplish X, Y, and Z goals, even if our revenue is at this level? And if the answer is no, then what we have to do is really focus on, okay, how do we guarantee more income? Or are there any expenses we can cut so that we feel better if the revenue comes in lower? And what you have to be really aware of is what you have more control over. What do you have more control over? The incoming revenue or the outgoing costs? Where does your decision of a yes or a no move the needle? Where does it move the needle? And for a lot of my clients, they don't have any control of their costs, really, because it's a lot of team. They would have to lay off people. They would have to make major decisions to lower costs. And they're basically just paying the cost it takes to fulfill and the cost it takes to operate the business they want. And they're in an investing season. So what we've decided to do is focus more on revenue. Focus on, okay, how can you supplement your revenue and create a recurring revenue stream to be able to surpass what those costs are that are going to be going up? So you have to be keenly aware of where you are in your business and what that means for you and how you should be focusing your attention. Because a lot of people will try to save their way, save costs and so on. And I say, well, that's fine. But at a certain point, you hit a critical mass of you're too lean and then you can't even support more sales. So what position do you want to be in, right? And another thing that people get wrong with forecasting is that they use, and admittedly, I'm one of these people sometimes, they use historical bookkeeping data solely historical bookkeeping data to drive future forecast. And while you might be thinking, Shan, like, wait, how else can I do this? Like, how would I predict the future without looking at the patterns of the past? Absolutely, you are correct. But here's how you should be forecasting your sales, especially. You should not be looking at historical sales. Yes, you can consider it. You can consider it. Don't ignore it. But if you say, okay, on average for the last year, we've made $120,000 in sales a month. Cool. Now, if that's the case, what about the future suggests that's going to keep happening? Is that going to keep happening? Just because it's happened before doesn't mean it will happen again. What you should be considering is what's called a sales pipeline. And if you're not familiar with this term, the pipeline is the incoming flow of sales that are expected to hit. And what you should have a really good grip on is, depending on what the size of our email list is, let's say email is a major lead source, or your social media, or whatever the size is of your audience that you're marketing to, how is that growing? Because if it's not growing, then you might be drying up your pipeline. And if the pipeline is drying up, your sales are drying up, and you won't be able to replicate what you've done in the past. What's unique about sales, especially in a digital economy, is that you have to constantly regenerate new sales, constantly regenerate new customers. And the likelihood of repeat customers is lower unless you have different elevating offers. So you're typically going to have somebody buy a course from you. Let's say it's a digital course one time. They're not going to buy 3. I mean, you could sell it to them as a marketing tool for their team or whatever, but like they're not going to buy 3 copies for themselves. So you have to think about, okay, if they're going to buy a copy for themselves, what else are they going to buy from me? How else can I keep them as a customer? Because just because you sold them one time doesn't mean you're going to sell more of them again. So my point being, when you look at pipeline, you have to look at what leads are coming in. What can you reasonably estimate you're going to sell in the next 1, 3, 6, 12 months to those people? Like, what has been your conversion rate? How are you performing respective to last quarter with generating new leads and new audience members? It could have been that the past 6 months that you're using to generate your forecast were uniquely because you launched something new, because you emailed more, because you were more present on social media. It could be any of those things. And if you're not aware of what the drivers are, then you won't be able to replicate that. So you have to use your pipeline and use your drivers to estimate your revenue, as opposed to simply looking at historical trends. It's not going to be enough to just look at the historical trends. And then finally, one thing people always miss is their personal cash flow needs when they're doing a cash flow forecast, how much they need to be taking out of the business, but also the increase in pay for your team, because you should be considering raises, scope increases, role promotions, role increases, whenever you're doing any type of forecasting. You have to be looking into the future and going, okay, if I'm really in tune with the goals of my team and where they want to be. Let's say, I know Courtney's listening to this, she's editing my shows, right? If Courtney says to me, Shan, I really want to elevate my role in the next 6 months, because we have these conversations with the team regularly. And she says, I want to elevate my role with the team and I want to take on a new position. Okay, great. Then I have to think about, when would that happen and what pay does that command? Because chances are if someone wants to elevate their role and increase their scope, they're going to want to increase their pay, obviously. That would be logical. So we have to think about, what do we want to be adding into the mix to reflect the increases in pay and the changes that will happen in the future in this next 6 to 12 months. Because if you're not factoring that in, you're assuming everything will stay where it is for the future. And even with inflation, even with everything else going on, you should be considering that everything's going to be more expensive in the next year. Everything's going to increase in price. So even if you're not increasing scope, you're not changing the people, you're not changing the roles, they're probably going to cost more in a year. They're going to be more valuable to you. And like I said, you want to be rounding up your expenses and rounding down your revenue. So when you do your cash flow forecasting, if you're sitting here early 2024 and you're like, okay, I want to do goals and projections for 2024, these are the things you need to be considering. Remember, focus on directionally correct over dead on accurate. Make sure you're looking at your pipeline of sales, not just what you've done historically. Make sure that you're being conservative about the revenue that you're expecting to bring in, and you're being aggressive on your expenses, rounding up, and even adding a few extra line items for other elective spending so that you know that you have a budget for that. And make sure you're factoring in pay raises and other cash flow needs that your team and you will have as you have this sort of lifestyle creep or as your business grows, so that you're able to maintain the cash flow that you need in that business. So again, if you're planning for 2024, these are all things you need to consider. If you want to sit down, whiteboard with me and actually go through this exercise with me, and we figure out exactly what your budgets and projections look like, this is the perfect example of what we can do in a power session. So if you're interested in booking a power session with me, it's basically 6 hours of my time dedicated exclusively with your business to go through and figure out exactly where we can support you, what your cash flow is going to look like, what some realistic goals are for you, and turning those into action steps you can focus on in the new year. So if you're interested, head to the link in the show notes to book a power session with me, and I'll see you on the next episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating and review on your podcast platform. This small action goes a long way for podcasters to get our message heard by more business owners just like you. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to information about our guests and ways to get in touch with me. We'll see you on the next episode.